wonderful to have you join us today. This is for a webinar that will be presented by David Raymond, who is joining us from Ottawa, Canada. And his topic is Assimilate or Be Exterminated. I'm Paula Palmer. I'm the co-director of Toward Right Relationship with Native Peoples, which is a program of Friends Peace Teams. I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples in the area that became the state of Colorado, the Boulder Valley. And I want to introduce Mackenzie Barton-Rolich, who is our TRR program support staff person, who is helping us with all the tech aspects of this program tonight. Mackenzie, do you want to wave and say hello?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mackenzie. I use ze, here, or she, her pronouns, and I live on Duwamish land, which settlers call Seattle.
Thanks, Mackenzie. If any of you run into some kind of a technical problem or question, please direct that to Mackenzie in the chat. We've set this up so that you can send chat messages to me, Paula Palmer, and to Mackenzie. Send your questions about technology to Mackenzie, and we will have a Q&A after David's presentation, and I'm going to be receiving the questions that you want to address to David. So you won't be sending those directly to David, you'll be sending them to me. So questions for David, send them to me. Questions about tech problems, send those to Mackenzie. This program is scheduled for 90 minutes, so we will attempt to honor that and end on time. And now about David. I know David because we are both Quakers, and we both serve on the steering committee of decolonizing Quakers. David also meets sometimes with a group of Quakers who are doing research on the role that Quakers played in the forced assimilation of Native children by operating Indigenous boarding schools. And he also meets with a group of people who identify as both Indigenous and Quaker. And I met David in person last June at a conference of the Friends Association for Higher Education, where David gave a plenary program. So David, we're very eager to hear from you tonight, very grateful to you for coming to us in this way. And David asked us to have a moment of silence as we are grounding ourselves for this presentation, and David will speak out of the silence.
Thank you for joining me, friends. Before I begin, I just wanted to say a couple things. Um, I was hoping to get this presentation under 45 minutes to leave a lot of time for questions, but I'm not sure if I'll be capable of doing that. So I'm just giving myself the leeway that I might go over. Um, if there's not a lot of room for questions at the end, I am going to be providing a handout in the coming days that'll contain all the quotes and references in my presentation, because I'd love it for people to go and look at the documents themselves and watch some of the YouTube videos that I've found. And, if you find something particularly provocative, or you think that maybe I've gotten something wrong, go check it out for yourself. And I would love to hear from you. Um, Something else I want to say is that nothing I'm saying here is meant as any criticism towards the indigenous nations that I might speak of. Um, what I'm looking at is the Quaker attitude in the documents. And of course, the documents themselves do have a lot of history in them and a lot of valuable things in them. But they're also written um, they're written from a very particular perspective that really discounts a lot of Indigenous peoples' experience. So while the documents themselves might talk about Indigenous peoples, you're not going to get an accurate representation of Indigenous peoples from reading old Quaker documents. What they're really going to tell you is what the Quaker attitudes were at that time, which I think is very valuable for friends to hear. Now, the language in some of the documents, of course, Quakers talk about Indians all the time, and that word comes up again and again. Now, that word can be very offensive to Indigenous peoples. Not to everyone, but to some people, it can be very offensive. To many Indigenous peoples, it can be very offensive. So I've kind of redacted part of that word throughout the slides, but I do have to speak it myself, just because, and I think it's important for Quakers to hear the full language that Quakers used at that time. But it's just in recognition that to make it clear that that word can be very offensive. And yeah, I think with that I'll begin. So when I was a child, um, I guess it was around 1990, and in the news there was the Oka crisis, which was a standoff between Mohawk and the Canadian government, soldiers and police. It was over a town's plan to expand a giant golf course onto disputed Mohawk territory. And so that was in the news. And I remember my grandmother on my father's side, she's Scottish Canadian. And and I loved my grandmother. I'll just say that. I really loved her, and she was very kind to me, very kind to my father. Not always so kind to my mom, though. But she kind of came over to me and she stooped down to me and she said, David, what we did to the Indians, it had to be done. I think she was seeing what was happening in the news, and it must have brought up some kind of emotion inside of her or something, and she felt the need to tell me this. I didn't really understand what she was saying, but there was something so disturbing about this that it stuck with me, and I kept thinking about it over the years. Now, on my mom's side of the family, we have Mi'kmaq ancestry. My grandfather was born at Natoaganeg First Nation in northern New Brunswick. And, it just troubles me the contrast between these two things, my father's parents and my mom's parents. And yeah, and I guess part of me you know, my grandmother said what we did to them. I mean, I don't think she meant her personally doing something um, in a direct sense. I think what she meant is the Canadians, Americans, uh, the overall system. And she felt whatever it was that we did had to be done. So I guess that's a question. It's a child's question. What what did we do? And why did we do it? And I guess just something else I'd like to mention is that I didn't grow up on the reserve. My mom would tell me things, every once in a while, maybe every year, my mom would share something with me um, about the Mi'kmaq. Just memories of her childhood and memories of seeing things. And she told me one year that it's not pronounced Micmac, which is the Anglicization of the word. It's the Mi'kmaq. But I didn't know a lot. But so what I feel like I am now is a reconnecting person, and I have a lot to learn. I'm only on the beginnings of that journey, but I'm grateful to have this connection to such a wonderful community. This is a painting from 1872 by John Gast called American Progress. It depicts many different things. I mean, you see the building of the railroads, um, the setting down of the telegraph wires. You see the miners heading off to California below, people breaking the land to turn into farmland. And on the left, you see Indigenous peoples fleeing west, along with wild animals and the buffalo. And you can see some buffalo carcasses out on the plains. An Indigenous man, Michael Yellowbird, um, in a video available online on mindfulness, actually. I wasn't always interested in mindfulness, but I watched his video and even though it was about mindfulness, he talked about real history, real things, and it kind of changed my mind a lot. But he describes this painting in his video. He says that the woman in the center, this who's floating above the scene, kind of bringing this light of progress over the land and dispersing darkness and the dark people out west. And he says this woman is actually Lady Columbia, the female personification of the violent colonizer, Christopher Columbus. And then he says that in her hand, she doesn't hold a Bible, but instead a school book. So this is a painting by Edward Hicks, cousin of Elias Hicks of the liberal Quaker fame. So there's some parallels with American Progress, actually, although there's also some important differences. So in the foreground is a image of the peaceable kingdom, which is an Old Testament story where the wild carnivorous animals lie down with the vegetarian animals and they don't eat them. And everything's at peace. And the scriptures say that a child will lead them. Now, of course, later in the Christian reinterpretation of this story, the child becomes Christ, or so is my understanding. And of course, just in like the John Gast painting, there were wild animals, but they were being driven away. And this one, they're kind of all coming together with the kind of more farm animals. Now, when I first came to Quaker meeting, it was probably around 2006, I think, here in Ottawa, Ontario. And maybe the second meeting I went to, a very kindly elder Quaker took me on a tour of the meeting house. And a print of this painting is down in the children's room. And he showed me the painting and he said, "Oh yeah, there's an image of William Penn meeting the natives." And then he told me, Quakers were unlike other people. They were really fair to the Indigenous peoples and created very good relations with them. And I mean, that's all he said to me. And we moved on with the tour. But of course, being very impressionable, it really got my imagination going. I believed everything he said, and I thought, wow, there's something about this that really captured me, as it's captured many people before me. And yet, when you look a little bit deeper into this history, there's kind of disturbing contradictions appear that are hard to reconcile. With William Penn, if you think about Pennsylvania, the colony that he helped found, it's not named after William Penn, of course. It's named after his father, the warrior. So this Quaker colony is actually named in honor of a soldier. So right there's a strange contradiction. Now, William Penn, he didn't like that name. He just wanted it to be called Sylvania. But the king insisted. So there's a compromise there. And of course, Pennsylvania was given to William Penn to pay the crown's war debts to his family. So again, this Quaker colony is paid for by war money, probably money in service of England's imperial adventures. William Penn's father led, as my understanding is that William Penn's father led the English in the conquering of Jamaica over the Spanish. And there's many other things that are kind of disturbing about this picture. A lot of people talk about this great treaty that was signed here, and yet no written treaty exists today. Some say there was never a written treaty. Others say that perhaps the Penn family destroyed the treaty in order to bolster its land claims and not have to follow the conditions that William Penn may have set out. But whether a treaty exists or not, I think it's true that a relationship was forged with the Lenape. Now, a lot of Quakers today will say, with all Indigenous peoples, this was an agreement. Well, no, it's with one specific group. And maybe he had relations with other groups that were in Pennsylvania as well, of course. And now you'll have to get used to these contradictions, because these contradictions will continue. And there's something that really disturbed me as I went through learning some of this history. This is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And I highly recommend it. And I also recommend the film that's partially based upon it, Exterminate All the Brutes, which is available on HBO. So I would recommend watching that as well. Now, Roxanne writes, so this is before colonization. The total population of the hemisphere was about 100 million at the end of the 15th century, with about 2/5 in North America, including Mexico. Central Mexico alone supported some 30 million people. At the same time, the population of Europe, as far east as the Ural Mountains, was around 50 million. The development of corn is a unique invention of the original American agriculturalists. And I just want to stop here and just say, many of these early agriculturalists were women. Roxanne continues, the vast reach and capacity of indigenous grain production impressed colonialist Europeans. A traveler in French-occupied North America related in 1669 that the 6 square miles of cornfields surrounding each Iroquois village. The governor of New France, following a military raid in the 1680s, reported that he had destroyed more than 1 million bushels, 42,000 tons, of corn belonging to 4 Iroquois villages. Thanks to the nutritious triad of beans, corn, and squash, which provide a complete protein, the Americas were densely populated when the European monarchies began sponsoring colonization projects there. I guess colonization projects just like William Penn's. Experts have observed that such population densities in pre-colonial America were supportable because the people had created a relatively disease-free paradise. There certainly were diseases and health problems, but the practice of herbal medicine and even surgery and dentistry, and most importantly, both hygienic and ritual bathing, kept diseases at bay. This is Agent Smith from the film The Matrix. And if you remember, if you've seen the film and you remember, he has a very dismal view of humanity. He's a AI creation. And he says to Morpheus that something about how human beings are like a virus or a parasite on the planet. And you know, he would be happy if they were all gone. And of course, Morpheus breaks free. Now, a more beautiful view of humanity than Agent Smith's is that of Lila June Johnston. She explains in this YouTube video humanity as a keystone species. She explains that actually human beings, when we learn our proper place in the web of life, are actually help bring about life and support life on this planet, that we actually have a needed role in the web of life, that we're not just parasites destroying everything, but that we can learn our place in that web of life. And that was a really, learning that was a powerful thing. Because of course, I'm sure you've all had friends and probably know people that say, oh, we're killing this planet and we are, the planet would be much better without us on it and everything would be so much better. And so to think that, well, no, actually, everything on this planet has its place and its role in that web of life. And human beings also have that place, not above the rest of the web of life, but as a part of it, as a humble part of it. This video is fantastic. She talks a lot about all of the amazing inventions and ways that Indigenous peoples have gathered so much knowledge, scientific knowledge about our world, about our planet. And I guess that's one point that I really want to make, is that sometimes people talk about Indigenous peoples and they say, oh, these are primitive people who are living in the past. They're just continuing things that were from some prehistoric time. But it's not true. Human beings go out in many different directions. And some people went out in a direction where they tried to, where they lived off of the land and became a part of that web of life. And over hundreds and even thousands and thousands of years, built up so much knowledge. And I'm not trying to paint the picture of the noble Indigenous person, Instead, what I want to say is that human beings are kind of amazing. You know, they learn things over thousands of years, they build up knowledge, and Indigenous peoples built up an incredible storehouse of knowledge that is no lesser than what other people have developed. And I think is actually part of our collective survival, that this is part of the human family that discovered things, that found out new things, that learned so much. And of course, the knowledge that they learned is part of our survival on this planet today. And I'm especially amazed by Indigenous women. Indigenous women were often the agriculturalists, the farmers, like I said before. They were engaged in crop development, experimentation, invention of blue corn, popcorn, flour corn. They discovered that the three sisters, corn, squash, and beans, grew best when planted together. Women provided most of the agricultural and domestic labor, and all residences, fields, and agricultural tools belonged to them. A surplus of corn contributed to the creation of trade centers near agricultural villages in the plains. Now, I should just mention here, you know, there's many, you know, this is one reason I like the term Indigenous peoples, because the peoples kind of indicates that there's multiple peoples. There's hundreds and hundreds of different groups and communities. Some that don't always see eye to eye. Some that have found things in their area and have developed kind of unique expressions in their area. Although it's also true that I think Indigenous peoples across the world do share certain things in common as well. So I'm not trying to say this applies to every single Indigenous nation out there, but for many, this was true. So at the National Park Service, USA, there's a really good article on Indigenous women's influence on the feminist movement. And I'll read you some of the passages from that. The Six Nation Haudenosaunee Confederacy had, and still have today, a family governmental structure based on female authority. Haudenosaunee women controlled the economy in their nations through their responsibility for growing and distributing the food. They had the final authority over land transfers and decisions about engaging in war. Children came through the mother's line, not the father's, and if the parents separated, the children stayed with their mother, and if she died, with her clan family. Women controlled their own property and belongings, as did the children. Political power was shared equally among everyone in the nation, with decisions made by consensus in this pure democracy, the oldest continuing one in the world. Now, for kind of an English view of what marriage is, which is really a perversion of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about how two married people become one flesh, which is a really beautiful, which is just a really beautiful expression that the early Christians wrote. But of course, over time, the church and government kind of perverted that message. And so this is from English law. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. Considered effectively dead, or at least invisible in the law, married women had no legal existence in the United States. They had no right to their property or their bodies. Husbands had the legal right to rape and beat their wives, as long as they didn't inflict permanent injury. Now contrast that with the Iroquois. If for any cause the Iroquois husband and wife separated, the wife took with her all the property she had brought into the wigwam. The children also accompanied the mother, whose right to them was recognized as supreme. And one comment that some of the earliest feminists would say, who had visited some of the reservations, was that at night, in the evening, they could walk alone without a male accompanying them and not be subjected to sexist commentary from the males, and not to fear being assaulted, which is something that would, I suppose, happen in some of the cities. One of those early visionaries was Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Of her experience with the Haudenosaunee, she said, "Never was justice more perfect. Never was civilization higher." And, for someone like Matilda Jocelyn Gage, I imagine, she was a real visionary of imagining women actually gaining freedom. And of course, when, I know this from my personal life, if I can imagine things and think, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? But you can imagine what a powerful experience it would be to find a people who are already living something that you've only imagined, where women are respected in that way and take full part in the community and in the decisions, and are sometimes the most respected members of the community, being the very portal of life into this world. Now, just to show you how difficult this can get, and the disturbing contradictions like I was talking about. The disturbing contradictions I was talking about. Matilda's son-in-law was Frank L. Baum, the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And after the massacre at Wounded Knee, but actually before the massacre at Wounded Knee, and then directly after the massacre, he wrote a bunch of atrocious things in his newspaper. This was before he became a children's author. So directly after the massacre, he wrote this: "Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up by one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth." Some people say that he was being sarcastic, or that this is some kind of satire. Now, what I've just read you was actually one of the nicer things he said in these newspaper articles. And I don't see the sarcasm, I don't see the satire in it, but even if you were to think that, it's, again, this is a point that I want to make too. It's not about judging Frank L. Baum. It's not about judging any of the other people that I'm going to be mentioning. I know some of these people are very beloved people. Some of them, Frank L. Baum is not a Quaker, obviously, but some of these are very beloved friends, even to this day. And I'm not trying to judge them personally. I'm not trying to tear them down or tear their reputations down. What's important here is what this indicates about what happened back then. What's important here is what this implicates about what has never been made right, and we may still have some of these attitudes today, as shocking as it is. It's not about judging these people, but it's I can't tell you not to feel upset by some of the words you're about to hear. They were upsetting to me. I went through all this, but I've actually over time come to respect people, even people I disagree with, very strongly. And, of course, Frank L. Baum, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is a very beloved story. But there's disturbing things in that story as well, like the flying monkeys. It's been thought by some that the flying monkeys are actually his depiction of Indigenous people. which maybe is a softening from this earlier version of himself. And of course, here's in the same family. He's the son-in-law to Matilda Gage. This is the cover of a very typical Indian committee document from the Quakers. And now you'll notice here, the title is A Brief Account of the Proceedings of the Committee, appointed in the year 1795 by the yearly meeting of Friends of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, etc., for promoting the improvement and gradual civilization of the Indian natives. And this word civilization, this word will come up again and again and again throughout my presentation. And I just want to take a moment to explain civilization. When Quakers talk about Indigenous Peoples civilization, they're not talking about an existing civilization. They mean it as a verb. Now, when Quakers talk about white people and civilization, they mean it as something that the white race has obtained, and that they are the very height of civilization. And they see Indigenous peoples as being entirely without civilization. That's why I really like that quote from Matilda Gage, where she recognizes that she has found a great civilization. But the Quakers don't see that, do they? This is Zitkala Sa, a Lakota woman, a writer, musician, an activist. And she had gone through the entire Quaker program. She, at age 8, she was taken from her mother and sent to white sporting school. She was very smart, very intelligent, although she resisted so much of what was being forced on her. But she also took a hold of anything good that she was able to learn. She eventually went to a Quaker college and even was a teacher at the infamous Carlisle Industrial School for a couple years, eventually resigning in disgust. And then she wrote this: "But few there are who have paused to question whether real life or long-lasting death lies beneath this semblance of civilization." Now, to give you an idea of some of the attitudes that Quakers had about their Indigenous brothers and sisters, this is from the Joint Indian Committee of the Liberal Friends. It was written sometime in the 1840s. I couldn't remember the exact date that this particular quote comes from, but it's from a book that was published in 1850. "Many of our fellow citizens now entertain the sentiment, and we have no doubt sincerely, that the Indian is an untamable savage, made for the wilderness and only capable of subsisting in a state of nature. We think the sentiment is erroneous, that circumstances only make the difference between them and the white men. Our ancestors in the island of Great Britain, when the polished Romans invaded their territory, were as savage as the natives of our own country at the planting of the first colony in Virginia. They painted their bodies and clothed themselves in skins. Centuries rolled away. The example of a civilized state with all its advantages was before them, and yet they remained nearly as barbarous as when first visited by a Caesar. 600 years after the invasion, they were far less improved in the arts of civilized life than are our Indians after the lapse of 1/4 part of that time." So here what these friends are saying is that Indigenous peoples are like an earlier version of white people, when white people were wild, barbarous, people who were just wild and warlike. And it's so interesting to see Quakers identify with empire, Quakers identifying with the Romans. I mean, that seems like a betrayal right there. But now Quakers have clearly feel that they are part of a great empire that is bringing this light of civilization to the dark people. In a similar vein, the Quaker John Greenleaf Whittier in 1877 wrote this: "The nomadic habits and warlike propensities of the native tribes are indeed formidable, but not insuperable difficulties in the way of their elevation. The wildest of them may compare not unfavorably with those northern barbarian hordes that swooped down upon Christian Europe, and who were so soon the docile pupils and proselytes of the peoples they had conquered. The Arapahoes and Comanches of our day are no further removed from the sweetness and light of Christian culture than the Scandinavian sea kings of the middle centuries, whose gods were patrons of rapine and cruelty. Their heaven a vast cloud-built alehouse, where ghostly warriors drank from the skulls of their victims, and whose hell was a frozen horror of desolation and darkness, to be avoided only by diligence in robbery, and courage in murder. The descendants of these human butchers are now among the best exponents of the humanizing influence of the gospel of Christ." And I mean, there's just so much wrong with this this quote. Of course, I don't think John Greenleaf Whittier knew next to nothing about Indigenous peoples. He probably knew next to nothing about the Vikings. Just a very, he's just entirely ignorant, but of course speaks like he knows it all. And you just can't help but feel, he doesn't see the irony in what he's saying. But when he talks about diligence and robbery and courage and murder, well, that's the founding of the colonizers coming here to Turtle Island. It's pure robbery, just like Pennsylvania is stolen land. So he should look to himself if he wants to look at people who have idolized robbery and courage and murder. But this just gives you an idea of what some Quakers thought back then about Indigenous peoples as being these artifacts from some distant past. So this is a portrait of the commanding officer of the United States Army in 1797, General James Wilkinson, the top soldier of the United States. And again, this is, just like the founding of Pennsylvania being founded in the name of a soldier, paid for by war money, this is another point of contradiction here. He writes this to his Quaker brother-in-law. I guess this man married into a Quaker family. I suppose his wife wouldn't be Quaker if he married her, given Quaker practices at the time of disowning people. So he says this, or he writes this in a letter to his brother-in-law. "What would that man or that community merit who should reclaim the untutored Indian, open his mind to sources of happiness unknown, and make him useful to society, since it would be in effect to save a race from extinction? For surely, if this people are not taught to depend for their sustenance on their fields instead of their forests, and to realize ideas of distinct property, it will be found impossible to correct their present habits, and the seeds of their extinction, already sown, must be matured." Now, several years later, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, will publish this letter along with an account of their early Indian committee work. And they say of the letter, "It may at once give information as to the condition of the Indians and confirm the propriety of what the committee has done." Now, maybe Quakers already had this idea that that Indigenous peoples are so inferior to what they called the white race that they were all destined to be to go extinct, and that the only way to save them was to eradicate their cultures. Maybe Quakers already had that idea, and this is just backup. This is the earliest expression that I found, but there's a lot more documents out there to read, obviously. But what really strikes me here is a couple things. What General James Wilkinson puts forward here is the program that Quakers will continue on for more than a century after this. They never changed their mind. They just double down again and again and again. And you have to ask yourself, why? How could they not have seen? How could they not, over all that time, not have had their minds open to the truth? How could they continue to be so blind, even as they spent so much time in Indigenous communities? And the answer that I have, that I feel, is pride. And there's different kinds of pride. There's a beautiful kind of pride. The pride of people saying, we're not going to be ashamed anymore because Christians, including Quakers, have tried to make us feel ashamed our whole lives. We're not going to feel ashamed just to be who we are, to be Indigenous. We're going to celebrate who we are. That's a beautiful kind of pride. It's just, and all nations do that. Germans celebrate certain days and their culture and their history. Other groups celebrate those things too. And now Indigenous peoples celebrate those things. That's a beautiful kind of pride. The same kind of pride at a pride parade. And then there's the toxic kind of pride. And now I thought in Christian culture, in traditional Christianity, that pride was the cardinal sin, the greatest sin. And I think that sin of pride, of thinking that, of not just celebrating who you are, but thinking that you are superior to others. This is, Quakers became seized with this kind of pride. And when we have that kind of pride, and you sit in meeting for worship, maybe you can hear a little bit of what a message coming to you, but you have a dirty lens, right? And you can't see as clearly anymore. And so you can't see the truth because you're not humble. You think that you're better than other people because you're a Quaker, because of your white skin, because you come from Europe, that you're so on a higher level of existence than others. That pride, and that pride still exists in Quaker meetings. It's not a Quaker thing. Everyone is susceptible to that pride. Indigenous peoples are susceptible to pride too. But I think the difference is when you're living in such close connection to the earth, that pride can become a lot more dangerous more quickly and can lead to disaster for a group if they're living in close relationship with the land. And so there's kind of a pressure against becoming that kind of prideful. Echoing the general's letter, Baltimore Yearly Meeting in 1805 wrote this. Now, this is part of this document that was published in London, England, because London, my understanding, and I don't know the full extent of this, but London Friends, London Yearly Meeting, as it was known at the time, today's Britain Yearly Meeting, was helping bankroll the cultural eradication efforts. And so, of course, Friends would occasionally publish in London the efforts that they were making. My understanding of this, and I could be a little bit off about some of the details, but I think they were publishing these things just to say, oh, here's what we're doing with some of the money you're sending us, and because you're interested in this. And I do want to say, of course, they probably do have a wholehearted interest in trying to do something to relieve the injustice that was happening. It's what makes it so complicated and so disturbing. So here's what Baltimore Yearly Meeting wrote in 1805. When we reflect on the gradual but continued decrease of these people, from the time the Europeans first visited this continent until the present, and the many whole tribes of which not any trace now remains, except their names, there is every reason to believe that should the Indians continue to pursue their former mode of life, a few centuries more, many other whole nations of them will become entirely extinct. Impressed with this melancholy consideration, it must be a prospect truly gladdening to the enlightened Christian mind to survey the hastening of that day when this part of the human family, weaned from savage habits and allured by the superior advantages of civil life, shall exchange the tomahawk and scalping knife for the plow and the hoe, and instead of ranging the forests in seeming affinity to the wild beasts of the desert, shall peacefully and rationally enjoy the productions of the fruitful field. Nor is this all. Added to the cultivation of the earth, the first step in the view of the committee towards many other important temporal advantages to be derived to this people from civil life. May not the promotion of this concern, which has thus far evidently prospered, prepare for and prove the means under the divine blessing through which may finally spread and prevail amongst these, our fellow men, that light and knowledge which so eminently distinguish the true Christian? So you'll hear some Quakers today say, oh, well, Quakers didn't try to push their religion. We're so different than those other Christians out there. We weren't trying to push our religion. We were just trying to give Indigenous peoples useful knowledge. But you can see in this writing that, in fact, these are the Quakers Quakers split apart and turned their backs on each other in the late 1820s, early 1830s. So this is before that, when Quakers are still kind of unified. But you can see here at that point, what Quakers are actually saying is these people are so inferior to us that they can't handle our high-minded religion yet. The first step is eradicating their cultures. And once that's done, the groundwork will be made to introduce the Gospels. Now later, the Orthodox Friends will eventually kind of take on kind of the more mainstream Christian culture of using Christianity to eradicate culture. Stanley Pumphrey, an English friend who came to Turtle Island and visited some of the reservations, and then quickly formed his own opinion on the matter, wrote this of the old Quaker maxim. The old maxim, civilize first, then try to Christianize, must be thrown away. And we must accept the axiom that Christianity is at once the shortest road to civilization and the best security for its maintenance. We fail in the most important part of all if we fail to bring these people to our Savior's feet. Remember how George Fox, by example and precept, urged upon our fathers to teach the Indians that Christ died for them and that the Holy Spirit is sent to them as well as to us. And so there you kind of see the splitting off of Orthodox Friends. And at that time, London Yearly Meeting, today's Britain Yearly Meeting, had swung Orthodox. It wasn't until the 20th century that they kind of switched a little bit towards the more liberal Quaker side. Now, this is back to the liberal Quakers around 1850, kind of giving their opinion on what's happening. The futility of all attempts to civilize the nations of our country was a general remark, and had induced many of our best citizens to believe that the Indian was exclusively the child of the forest, the wild man of the woods, irreclaimable, and destined to perish in the presence of the Caucasian race. Nor can we wonder that such sentiments should prevail. Experience seemed to support, if not confirm them. Though William Penn, with his peace-loving brethren, brought no weapons of destruction to prepare his way to dominion, yet the natives melted away before him, if not as rapidly, yet as certainly and extensively as they did before the more belligerent emigrants. The Southern colonists, though not distinguished for aggressive war on the Indians, yet did not scruple to destroy them whenever political or personal safety seemed to demand it. The New England settlers pursued them with fire and sword, slew thousands of them, and almost exterminated several of their tribes. And yet they were not more effectually expelled from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut than they were from Pennsylvania. So the point that that these Hicksite friends are making is that, yes, it's true. This is what they think, not what I think. Yes, it's true that indigenous peoples are completely inferior to the white race and they're destined for extinction. But what they're saying in this, and they're putting this in the terms of their work with the Seneca, who had adopted a Republican style of government around this time. They say, well, here's an example of a people who are leaving behind their traditions. And so we can save indigenous peoples from their fate of being exterminated. And of course, what is extermination? It's the intentional killing of entire ethnic groups. So Quakers see, oh, we can save them because we can turn them into white people. Here's Baltimore Yearly Meeting in 1805. Long established habits are nowhere easily eradicated, and few nations appear to adhere more strongly to the customs of their ancestors than these people. Added to this, their ardent attachment to personal freedom, and their having heretofore been entire strangers to any kind of restraint, render them impatient of labor and in some measure averse to the pursuits of a steady, industrious life. When I read this, it really kind of disturbed me. I already understood at this point that Quakers were eradicating indigenous peoples' cultures, but here it is spelled out so plainly and clearly. I don't like what this says, but I do appreciate the earlier friends' like of plain language. It's very clear. They're trying to eradicate the customs of the ancestors. They're trying to eradicate personal freedom. Well, I thought Quakers were all about personal freedom. I thought that's why they had left England, so that they could have the freedom to worship and live the way that they chose. But clearly here they've turned against it. A betrayal of their own faith. Now, of course, if you were going to attempt to eradicate a culture, and that culture is a matriarchy, what do you think your target is going to be? Well, of course, it's going to end up being the women and girls. That will be the center of your target. Quakers, I don't think at first understood that they were eradicating matriarchies. But when they looked at it, they said, we're superior to these indigenous peoples. And what's the difference between us? Oh, they look and they see indigenous women farming, indigenous women chopping wood and bringing wood home and doing things that very powerful people would do, right? And they said, perhaps here is the key to eradicating these people's cultures. This is Baltimore Yearly Meeting, 1806. The young women wished to work in preparing the ground and attending the corn. From this, he dissuaded them, And as some spinning wheels had just arrived at Fort Wayne, which had been sent by government, he encouraged them to go there and learn to spin and knit of a white woman. Here's Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, 1798, very early document. It was not right to suffer their women to work all day in the fields and woods, either in cultivating with the hoe all that was raised for their subsistence, or getting firewood and bringing it home on their backs, whilst the men and boys were at the same time amusing themselves with shooting arrows from their bows, or some such diversions. And I just want to say the picture here is of powerful women providing the lifeblood of their community. And the men are shooting bows and arrows, right? Well, they're learning the skills that are necessary for hunting and survival. They're also learning the skills necessary for defense and war. These are really important things in a community. But the Quakers see it as the men are being lazy and the women are their slaves. And they have the women doing all the work while they're just playing fun and games with their bows and arrows. And of course, why do Quakers think that? Pride. They think that their ways are better, and they just can't. When you're that prideful, you can't see reality anymore. Baltimore Yearly Meeting, 1804. Brothers, the white people, in order to get their land cultivated, find it necessary that their young men should be employed in it, and not their women. Women are less than men. They are not as strong as men. They are not as able to endure fatigue and toil as men. It is the business of our women to be employed in our houses, to keep them clean, to sew, knit, and spin and weave, to dress food for themselves and families, to make clothes for the men and the rest of their families, to keep the clothing of their families clean, and to take care of their children. Now, I also want to just give a special mention of queer people, because you can imagine Quakers coming in and other colonizers coming in with such strict boundaries of what a woman and a man should do. And you know who are some of the first people who are going to be negatively affected by this. This is Relentless Indigenous Woman on Facebook, September 20th. That was a day when there were a whole series of homophobic marches happening in Canada. So Relentless Indigenous Women writes, queer people have always existed in Canada. Since the beginning of colonization, the erasure of Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus people was the first on the agenda. Colonization is still prevalent under the guise of Christian values and love. This is why it's important to understand the implications of being tolerant, of theologies that insist on marginalizing people that have been on these lands since time immemorial. Honestly, if Jesus were here, he'd be standing with queer people. I say this with every conviction I have. There's no space for hate, not for me. And I've worshiped with Quakers who hold on today, not even hold on, who have created hateful doctrines that they place at the center of their faith, placing doctrines before Christ Jesus, a total betrayal of their religion and a total betrayal of Christ Jesus. And I have no tolerance for that anymore. And I'm also grateful for all the many yearly meetings, including Canadian Yearly Meeting, that have been on the forefront of change and the forefront of finally recognizing and putting aside the evils that they had participated in for so long. Here's a document from 1847. Again, this is from the Seneca documents. Now you'll see that Genesee Yearly Meeting is first named on the document. Genesee Yearly Meeting represented the liberal Friends of Western New York and Canada at that time. Now, Canada as a country wasn't in existence, so what we're really talking about is Upper Canada, which is Ontario. Now, there were some Friends outside of Upper Canada, but, you know, virtually all Friends were in Upper Canada at the time. So really, this is the Canadian Friends, the Liberal Friends of Canada. Now, they're first named on the document because for a period, Genesee Yearly Meeting was the primary yearly meeting working with the Seneca Nation. Now, by this time, the yearly meetings have kind of gotten together again, and they're kind of taking on this concern together. And so they write about the situation with the women. And this is an actual address to Indigenous peoples, to the Seneca. You say you desire to raise yourselves to the condition of a civilized, intelligent people. Can you reasonably expect to do this while your wives and daughters continue to be employed in the menial labor to which they have so long been subjected? We tell you plainly it will be impossible, and that there is not now in the whole world, nor has there ever been, any nation or people who held their women in a state of servile dependence and imposed upon them the severe drudgeries of hard labor that ever were or ever could be civilized. It is the peculiar characteristic of savages and not of civilized men to treat their women in this way. And besides, it is perverting the wise order and purposes of Providence and ought not to be tolerated. How can you expect that your wives can rear civilized, intelligent children when they themselves are left without education and are kept in a state of degraded ignorance? Surely such mothers can only rear ignorant and barbarous children. Do you not know that it is to mothers we are to look for the necessary care and instruction in cultivating the seeds of virtue and every noble principle in the breasts of children? Without the change now proposed, our hopes of being able to avert the evils which must follow your present course would be extinguished, and all prospect of our doing you any good would be at an end. In that event, we would prefer to withdraw from you rather than by remaining near, be obliged to witness the ruin which we believe would come upon you. Friends like these, huh? So a few years later, looking back on the result of their earlier appeal, and actually just before I say this, I wanted to say that the Quakers have been trying the same thing with the Seneca for 50 years at this point. And so while it's depressing reading the Quaker viewpoint, I mean, their viewpoint and their views on so much are just totally depressing. But what's actually really beautiful is when you think about it, 50 years, they've been telling these people, get your women out of the fields. They belong as housewives, not as farmers. Confine them to the house. But even after 50 years, the Seneca have not listened, because it's insane. It doesn't make any sense. It's just pure stupidity and ignorance. Of course, why do the Quakers feel that way? Because of pride. They believe that they are on a higher level of existence than Indigenous peoples. They can't see the truth. They can't see what's right in front of them. And the other frustrating thing, it's obvious that Quakers really do care about women, really do, think that women should be elevated in some way, I suppose. And of course, there were many strong Quaker women who became feminists and who pushed forward things. And in Quaker meetings, from the beginning, women were allowed to speak, which was a big thing. And so that's one of the really disturbing contradictions. But I remember whenever I'm reading all of these documents, when we're going through this, I always think, yeah, the Quaker view is very dismal. But if you step back and look at a bigger picture, you realize, well, Indigenous peoples are resisting every step of the way. Of course, they're taking what they think is valuable to them that the Quakers are teaching them, but they're also kind of like, we're not into this other stuff that doesn't make any sense, because some of it is just bad shit crazy. So this is friends looking back at the effects of what they've been trying to tell the Seneca. Friends thought they could discern one of the causes of the difficulty universally experienced in every attempt to civilize the race. They saw females degraded to the condition of menial servants of the men, field laborers and burden bearers. It was obvious that women in such an ignorant, uncultivated state could not rear civilized children. Under these considerations, the committee determined, if possible, to break the custom. From what has been seen of its effects upon the Seneca nation in the short space of 3 years, there is reason to conclude that in this point lies the great secret of Indian civilization. Every community is divided into classes in various states of civilization. The elevation of these classes above the elevation of any of these classes above the savage state may always be ascertained by the character of their women. If they be found intelligent and virtuous, prepared as well for the due performance of the domestic duties as for the enjoyment of intellectual pleasures, shining equally in the sphere of usefulness as in scenes of domestic ease and comfort, the friends and companions of their husbands in the cares as well as the pleasures of life, qualified to take a dignified position in the home department and in the more extended sphere of general society, there we may confidently look for civilization. For this is civilization itself. Civilization is a term used to express a state opposite to barbarism, and barbarism, wherever found, is marked by the degradation of the female sex. The truth is that savage custom had driven woman from her proper sphere, and domestic happiness could not enter the dwelling in her absence. The manual labor school was established as one of the means of restoring woman to the station evidently designed for her in the benevolent order of her creator, an order which cannot be broken with impunity. And so here we see one of the key reasons for the schools to teach Indigenous girls their new role as housewives, not as the matriarchs. This is a really important document that I found, and I found this through the Canadian Friends Historical Association, which is an amazing website. And it's Canadian, but it also has a lot of information that would be really interesting to USA friends. They've transcribed a whole bunch of the old minutes, and this one is Genesee Yearly Meeting. This was a shocking revelation for me. I had made the connection that Quakers had run the schools from Paula Palmer's article in the Friends Journal. But it was reading this where I really saw kind of the more intricacies of what Canadian Friends were involved in. And you'll see this is in 1872 when the yearly meeting was held in Pickering, Ontario, because the Canadian side of the meeting was becoming stronger and the New York side was kind of diminishing a little bit. And so the yearly meeting, yearly meeting started to be held in Ontario. So this is Joseph Webster, a Quaker Indian agent. That also blew my mind. Quaker Indian agent. Because when I think of Quakers in the Canadian context, I think of a villain. I mean, I know it's more complicated than that, but in general, I think of a villain, a person there to enforce the government's policy of confining Indigenous peoples to reserves. A person you would have, if you wanted to leave the reserve and go hunting, you'd have to go and say, "Can I please have a pass?" And he'd give you a pass, and then you could hold on to that pass just in case some white person comes along and says, "You shouldn't be off the reserve." And then you can hold up your little pass that you got from the Indian agent. people who were facilitating a genocide. So it was bizarre when I heard Quaker Indian agent. It was like, that can't go together, but it does. So Joseph Webster says about this whole woman situation, friends must bear in mind that the whole character of the Indian must be changed. In his natural or wild condition, the man is the lord, the woman his slave. For a man to work would be to unsex himself or become a squaw, which appellation would be the greatest indignity that could be placed upon him. This is Niagara Falls. And I think it was around 1851 or 52 that Sunderland P. Gardner, a very prominent friend who lived part of his life in Canada and was a member of Genesee Yearly Meeting, he visited this scene with someone from the Zavitz family, and he remarked, "It is now seldom that we see the Indian pass this way. He has been driven from his birthright, gone from his hunting grounds, and given place to the white man. They are mostly sleeping with their warrior ancestors, leaving but few traces that such a people ever lived." So this is kind of the myth of the disappearing Indigenous person. And of course, it's just the same opinion that you've already seen. They're all going to go extinct. Their ways are done now. We're going to replace them. It's manifest destiny expressed by this Quaker. And he was at yearly meeting. If you read the minutes of Genesee Yearly Meeting, he was at yearly meeting practically every year. He would have heard the reports of the Indian Committee. He knew the Seneca still existed. So it kind of makes me wonder what's going through his head, And of course, who has the freedom to go to Niagara Falls or go anywhere he chooses? The white man. He can go anywhere he wants. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples are being confined to reservations and reserves. They can't travel there anymore. That's why they're not showing up there anymore. And he knows better. In a history book called The Quakers of Iowa from 1914, it kind of looks back at this period, a little bit after Sunderland visited Niagara Falls. At once, from various parts of the nation, there came a demand for the complete extermination of the Indian race by the military arm of the government. It was at this juncture that the Friends, with their program of peace, stepped in. And of course, this is shocking for me. I didn't know that. I didn't know that there was this fairly mainstream call for the extermination of all Indigenous peoples. It's not something that I learned in school. And yet here it is from the page, this you'll read, when you go back and read these old documents, you hear it again and again. Extinction, extermination. People think that they should all die again and again. So delegations of Friends did go to visit the president. A delegation of Orthodox Friends visited him first, and and Liberal Friends came right on their heels. But to the Orthodox Friends, President Ulysses S. Grant said the following: "Gentlemen, your advice is good. I accept it. Now give me the names of some friends for Indian agents, and I will appoint them. If you can make Quakers out of the Indians, it will take the fight out of them. Let us have peace." This is called the peace policy, and perhaps by some enthusiastic Quakers, the Quaker policy. And we see what peace has meant at some times for Friends in the past. It meant the pacification of people fighting for their homelands, fighting not to have their children kidnapped and taken away to government re-education centers, fighting for their dignity and their right to hunt and to live their lives as they choose. Now, as part of this peace policy, Quakers went out and surveyed some of the reservations. Now, a delegation from Genesee Yearly Meeting and Ohio Yearly Meeting wrote the following. The present agent and wife are very desirous that the dwelling near the schoolhouse should be enlarged and an industrial school started, where the children can be kept in the institution and taught the habits and arts of civilized life. It is the opinion of all the agents that the industrial school is the best adapted to the wants of the Indians. They will then be removed from the contaminating influences of the home circle, where they lose at night the good impressions they have received during the day. With these views, the committee fully unite. Now, this is the first time I made a connection that Genesee Yearly Meeting, representing Canadian Friends, was involved in this work, was involved with schools. They were clearly involved with the school with the Seneca, and then they became involved with the school with the Sante Dakota. And I realize that we are getting on in time here, but I'm just going to continue and hopefully you'll forgive me. And if you have to leave, then I totally understand too. I hope this is going to be okay. Now, Oglala Lakota Chief Red Cloud visited President Grant a couple years after the Quaker policy was put in place. And he said this, and I also want to say, it's not the peace policy. Other churches were involved as well. And did the Quakers start this? I mean, Quakers take a lot of credit for it. This is one of the proudest moments of Quakerism at that time. This was the biggest thing that they had ever done, according to them. That's why they call it the Quaker policy. It's the peace policy. But other churches were involved too. And the Quakers, probably the proportion of how many Quakers there are in the country to Catholics and to Baptists and others. So other churches took part. And I don't know if the Quakers really did start it or if President Grant already had this in his mind, but Quakers sure make it seem like they did. So Oglala Lakota Chief Red Cloud protested to President Grant about this new policy. The riches we have in this world, we cannot take with us to the next world. Then I wish to know why agents are sent out to us who do nothing but rob us and get the riches of this world away from us. Now, were Quakers robbing Indigenous peoples? I haven't seen anything that says they were directly taking money and pocketing it. And yet there are things, but I think in the general sense that maybe Chief Red Cloud means they were robbing them. They were facilitating a giant theft. And it gets really disturbing for me at this point. It was another point where I was like, kind of blew my mind a little bit here. So this is Samuel Janey. He was kind of a more grand Indian agent who was kind of responsible for the whole of the liberal Quakers portion of the Indian of the peace policy work. And he wrote this, and this is a letter to the highest reaches of the United States government. This letter was about his, because he's a government agent now, right? And he wrote, "We have found by experience that very many of the Indian men may be induced by liberal wages promptly paid to perform the agricultural labors that were formerly imposed on their women." Now think about that. He's paying Indigenous men to farm. But where does that money come from? Well, Quakers advocated for the selling of Indigenous land. They called it land in excess. So, Indigenous peoples already being forced off of their homelands and put on reservations. And then Quakers and other groups come in and say, well, each Indian male head of the household should get a small plot of farmland. And then there's always a lot of land left over. Maybe half of the land hasn't been divvied up in this way. And so what Quakers advocated for was the selling of that land. And then the using of that land to fund the cultural eradication experiments. And that's on top of the, because sometimes the government would say, we're forcing you to move west, but we're going to compensate you to a certain value of what the land is worth at that time. And so they would the government would hold that in trust. And so again, they're using that money. So think about it. It's like somebody coming into your bank account, somebody coming to say, I want you to farm now, and I'm going to pay you for it. And then to pay you for farming your land, they go into your bank account and take out money and said, oh, we're going to release some of your own money to you to entice you to farm and get your women into the house where they belong. Well, that sounds like fraud to me, but I understand these Quakers believe that because they believe that they are from a superior race and Indigenous peoples are so inferior that they're all going to die, that they will go to any lengths. It doesn't matter how disgusting. I remember reading this. It was another moment where I had to walk away for a long time. Now, to give you a different experience, Indigenous peoples are having their land. I'm almost done, by the way. I'm, maybe 5-10 minutes, I think. So just to give you another experience of what other people are going through at this time. These are two Quaker brothers, Albert and Alfred Smiley. And I'm just going to read you this passage from a book about them from back then. In 1869, Albert Kay visited Lake Mohonk and was so well pleased with the beauty and picturesqueness of the spot that he concluded to obtain possession for a summer home for himself, and also for the purpose of establishing a summer resort there. He had once purchased the lake, together with 300 acres of land, and has made of it a most unique resort. He has added to his possessions year by year, until the estate consists of upwards of 3,500 acres, extending along the crest of the mountains about 6 miles, with an average width nearly 1 mile, over and through which he has had constructed about 40 miles of private roads, together with 25 miles of walks. For the first 10 years, the property was managed by Alfred H. Smiley. This was his retirement plan. This is what some people's retirement plans were back then. I don't know about you, but this is not my retirement plan, to go buy a mega resort, to build a mega resort. This is their retirement plans. For the first 10 years, the property was managed by Alfred H. Smiley, who, in 1875, had purchased Minnewaska, a twin lake with more than 2,500 acres of land 7 miles distant, on the top of another spur of the Adirondacks, where he has built 2 fine hotels capable of accommodating 450 guests. Now, at that resort, that mega resort, the Smiley brothers would host a group called the Friends of the Indians. Not a Quaker group, in spite of this name. Now, the Smileys are Quakers, but the Friends of the Indians was not a Quaker group, though Quakers were involved, as you can see. And the Friends of the Indians were wealthy white people who would lobby the government on behalf of Indigenous peoples. And their idea was for the complete and total eradication of Indigenous peoples' cultures, the ending of all tribal entities, and for each individual Indigenous person to become just like white people and be completely absorbed into the United States. And it's so ironic, isn't it? This mountain retreat that they made, they were just able to go and say, I'll take the lake. I'll take all the land around the lake and build a resort for our retirement. And there we're going to host a group called the Friends of the Indians, who are working towards the complete destruction of Indigenous peoples' cultures for their betterment. I mean, here's where Lake Mohonk sits on the map at nativeland.ca. And I'm not condemning these two men. I'm sure that they did share the land with anybody who wanted to come, and especially if you wanted to pay for a night at their resort. I'm sure they were very generous people. And that's what makes this so disturbing, right? Now, the flip side of the peace policy is this. This is Ulysses S. Grant speaking to one of his generals. Now, the general was complaining that Ulysses was saying, well, those Indigenous peoples who agree to go along with this plan, we do kind of have to try to protect them from white invaders who are still encroaching onto their reservations. And so he says this to his general. Indians who will not put themselves under the restraints required will have to be forced, even to the extent of making war upon them, to submit to measures that will ensure security to the white settlers of the territories. And of course, what is the policy? Confining people to reservations, taking their children away, pushing them into poverty. And of course, some people fought back, right? Resulting in the Modoc War in California, the Red River War in Texas, the Nez Perce conflict in Oregon, the Black Hills Campaign by General George Armstrong Custer, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn. President Grant also oversaw the destruction of the buffalo herds, a way of starving populations into submission. You know, a weapon of war that has been used in the past and is still used today. So, I mean, that's the flip side of the peace policy, right? Peace through strength, I guess you could call this. Do what we tell you or we'll kill you. Now back to Pickering, Ontario. So this is from the same report of that Indian agent. And now this part is about Indigenous peoples' way of governing themselves and how Quakers work to end that way of governing. So this is what Webster says. Very soon after I commenced my work among them, he's talking about the Sante Dakota, I perceived that this mode of governing the bands by hereditary chiefs was an evil, that it had a tendency to retard their advancement in civilization, and resolved to use my best endeavors to bring about a reformation. My idea is to make the office elective for the term of 1 year. Now, a 1-year election cycle, it's thought, is a way to control Indigenous nations, because if you have to elect somebody new every year, it's a lot, the person is in constant election mode. And so this weakens it's thought that this weakens Indigenous groups and allows for easier government control over their lives and especially their lands. In Canada, the Indian Act mandated First Nations to have elections every 2 years. And this is 1 year, 1 year. I will instance a case that occurred last 7th day and was disposed of in council today. Some time ago, War Club, Wabashaw's head man, built a house on a claim that was previously taken by another. I remonstrated with him kindly, tried to convince him that when these allotments were taken, the owners held certain rights and privileges that could not be invaded without subjecting the aggressing parties to the offense of trespassing. And I just want to stop for a second. Trespassing. The Sante Dakota, just several years earlier, were banished from their homelands by greedy white settlers. And, and here's this man telling them about trespassing and property. He, War Club, refused to listen to entreaty and disregarded my preemptory orders. The time certainly had arrived to do something decisive, or to give up the idea of anything like systemic government. In a council this forenoon, after explaining to the chiefs and head men my reasons for so doing, I told them that War Club would no longer be considered a member of the council, and if they had a better man to offer to fill his place, I would accept him. If not, I would appoint one myself. I expected a scene and was surprised to find how gracefully they accepted the situation. Wabasha, head chief, said when they were in Minnesota, he considered himself equal in rank with the agent, but now he supposed he was a grade below him. and Joseph Webster, who just, again, pride. He thinks he is on a higher level than Indigenous peoples. He can't even hear the cynicism in Wabashaw's voice. I mean, I can hear it. What about you? And yeah, Wabasha. Here's a photograph of Chief Wabasha III. So Wabasha had, he had been somebody who had tried to keep some peace during the troubles that had happened during the Dakota uprising. And it's a really complicated history, and I don't know the whole thing, and I don't want to misrepresent anything. But I'll just say, at the conclusion of that, President Lincoln ordered 30 of the Dakota to be more than 30 of the Dakota to be hung to death in the largest mass hanging in United States history. A terrible scene, a terrible sight. And Chief Wabashaw's son-in-law, who was an innocent man, because President Lincoln just chose these people at random off of a list, the people who were going to die. Chief Wabashaw's son-in-law was one of the men sentenced to die. He wrote a letter to Chief Wabashaw about this and bemoaning the whole fact and the injustice of all this. That's who Joseph Webster is talking to. No respect for what happened to these people, because he just sees it, oh, these are just wild Indigenous peoples, and I'm so much better than them. And I'm sorry, friends, I know I'm going over, but I'm just going to keep going here. I really am almost done. I think I've got like 5 more slides. I really apologize. Okay, so this is another instance of liberal Quakers attempting to destroy Indigenous forms of governance. And I don't know how successful they are. I know after Chief Wabasha died, Sante Dakota did adopt a 1-year election cycle, but I'm not sure how long that lasted. But here's another example. This is from Friends and the Indians, which is a really haunting tome written by one of these I would call them kind of white supremacist, assimilationist Quakers. So he writes, Howard White has related personally to the author how he changed the chiefs and established an elective system among the Winnebagos. Early in his service as agent for this tribe, he found the tribal government dominated by a group of old conservative chiefs who were utterly incompetent and strongly averse to all civilizing influences. These men were opposed by many of the younger Indians and half-breeds who believed that their only salvation was, as a people, was to adopt the ways of white men and become civilized. Consequently, Agent White stepped in and deposed all the old chiefs and appointed younger and more progressive men in their places. After a period of time, he allowed for an election for chiefs to be held, and the result was that progressive men were largely chosen. Now, I know a lot of people talk about election interference today in Canada and the United States and fears about the democratic process. Well, here's what these liberal friends were doing back then. His story of the election shows how hard it is for a primitive people to become inured to the ways of modern democracy. He announced the hours during which the polls would open. At the close of the time, the ballots were counted and the result announced. At once, a defeated candidate rode off at full speed on his pony and in due time returned with enough of his Indian friends who had not voted to turn the tide of election in his favor. The agent explained to him that the polls were closed and the election over. Such stringent regulations were too much for the Indian to understand, and he went away sorrowful, protesting against the gross injustice of the white man's ways of government. And I remember reading this book, Friends for 300 Years, maybe in the first few years that I was a Quaker, that I had first come to the Quaker meeting here in Ottawa. And of course, I was always looking for these, because of being shown that painting, the Hicks painting, I was always looking in the index for Indian and then going through the books just to find, what the story that I was told. I was looking for it and I couldn't find it. And so you come across strange things like this. So of course, by Howard Brinton's time, I think this was first written in the 1930s. Perhaps some Quakers were starting to ask questions like, well, Indigenous peoples had consensus decision-making, a form of consensus decision-making, but we attempted to eradicate those processes. How can we eradicate a process that we still enjoy ourselves? Maybe Howard Brinton even wondered about this, because at the end of his chapter on business practice, he writes the following. It's kind of a bizarre thing until you know that history, right? He writes, the organic method of arriving at decisions by consensus appears at the primitive pre-individual level, as well as at the advanced post-individual level. In the first case, self-centeredness has not yet developed. In the second case, it has been overcome. Such councils where sex equality is maintained and voting unknown indicate that the organic method is in accord with human nature as it evolved out of primitive matriarchal conditions. The more mechanical method of voting becomes natural in a later stage of development when society has become more individualistic. But there is a still further stage when self-conscious individualization is surpassed but not eliminated in a divine human community so inspired by the one spirit that it can act as a unit. Now, just imagine what he's actually saying here. He's saying that Indigenous peoples are pre-individuals. Oh, sorry about that. Let me get back to my slides here. I don't know if you've lost my video, but that's okay. So he's saying that Indigenous peoples are pre-individuals. They are on the lowest rung of humanity. And then he kind of explains why their consensus decision-making needed to be eradicated. They needed to be forced into this individual stage, a higher stage of humanity, which I guess is what the rest of us live in. But there's a further stage that the Quakers have obtained. The Quakers are the highest form of humanity, living in a divine human community. This is the same man who came up with the spices. He invented the spices, peace, equality, simplicity. He only and integrity. I think those are the ones that he had. I didn't used to like these testimonies, these spices. I thought they were kind of presumptuous for Quakers to say, we have a Quaker testimony about equality because we're so much better at this. And of course, once you actually look at the history and you realize that Quakers have spent much of their history attempting to eradicate other people's cultures because they felt they were on a superior level. And here you see the great liberal Quaker saying that he is on such a high level that he has become a post-individual. He's even higher than the rest of society, let alone Indigenous peoples, all a way to explain why Quakers would eradicate practices that they themselves continue to enjoy. And again, now I kind of like the spices, actually. And I'm not trying to judge Howard Brinton. I'm not trying to throw away all the good things that Howard Brinton did or said. I don't like his writing. I find it very pseudo-intellectual. And just his use of words is just totally unneeded. I much prefer those plain friends from before this. But when I think of the spices, for example, knowing this, I'm like, well, I don't have to follow his spices. I can have my own spices. I choose peace and justice. Peace and justice. I choose equality and equity. And I just choose ones that I make them the way that I want. And I actually have a lot more respect for them now that I realize they don't have the power they had before. You know what I mean? Which was a good thing. This is John Greenleaf Whittier, who I mentioned before. Now, when I look at this photograph, I see a man determined. This is a man who took part in staring down the evils of slavery. He was an abolitionist, determined man. But what disturbed me, this is another part where I got so disturbed after reading this that I had to, again, walk away for a while. That happened to me a lot. There's a lot of starts and stops. So what I didn't realize is that a lot of the abolitionists were still believed in white supremacist ideologies. Now, of course, President Lincoln famously believed that the white race was inherently superior, at least over Black people. He believed that the white race would always rule over them. And at the same time, he had a large part to play in the partial abolition of slavery. And again, it's complicated. And that's why I don't feel like judging these people, right? But at the same time, we should still understand what they actually said and believed. And so here's the great Quaker abolitionist, John Greenleaf Whittier. And while he stared down the evils of slavery, he still believed that white European Christian culture was absolutely superior and that Indigenous peoples' cultures needed to be eradicated. He writes in an address called The Indian Question. Remember that, the Indian Question. The westward setting tide of immigration is everywhere sweeping over the lines of the reservations. Outbreaks of Indian ferocity and revenge, incited by wrong and robbery on the part of the whites, will increasingly be made the pretext of indiscriminate massacres. The entire question will soon resolve itself into the single alternative of education and civilization or extermination. The school experiments at Hampton, Carlisle, and Forest Grove in Oregon have proved, if such proof were ever needed, that the roving Indian can be enlightened and civilized. What is needed is that not only these schools should be more liberally supported, but that new ones should be opened without delay. Here's a map showing the so-called Indian boarding schools in the United States and the so-called Indian residential schools in Canada. And this doesn't include the day schools in Canada or the United States. Hundreds of more schools could be added to this list. These are the boarding schools where children are sent to live in dormitories, many of which are very far away from their communities and their families and their parents. This is exactly what John Greenleaf Whittier envisioned. This is a photograph of one of the more notorious forced assimilation camps, the infamous Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Now, it's not a Quaker school per se, and yet individual Quakers generously helped fund the school at its startup, essentially giving its founder a blank check. There would be Quakers who would take their role on staff at the school. And Quakers would be some of the primary beneficiaries of the so-called outings program, where instead of sending the children home during the summer recess to their families, the children would be lent out to wealthy white families, and again, many of which were Quaker, to be their servants. I guess to teach them the value of hard work. And while they got paid a tiny salary compared to similar people doing work like this And much of that salary was held in trust at the Carlisle Institute. And so, well, it's, and just that blew my mind too, the Quaker connections to this school. This school is a model school for the residential school system in Canada. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report from Canada, there's even a few pages devoted just to this school. And what was the founder's words? So this photograph is from 1792. The same year, the founder, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, gave a speech, and he said the following: "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." And of course, I've heard this term my whole life: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Now, I didn't totally understand what this is. And sometimes in Canada, you'll hear people say, kill the Indian in the child, as kind of, this is ascribed to different Canadian politicians who may have said that. And maybe they did. Maybe they did say something very similar to this. Maybe they were inspired by Pratt. Or maybe that line is actually just somebody taking this line and changing it, even though that's a pretty accurate description of it. So when he says kill the Indian, what he means is destroy Indigenous culture, destroy scientific knowledge, destroy matriarchy, destroy spiritual dancing, destroy the knowledge of our place in the interconnectedness web of life. And if successful, and then the save the man part. Before, I didn't know what that part meant. It's like, save the man from what? Well, now I hope it's clear, friends. Save the man from the necessity of the white race exterminating every last one of them. That's what save the man means. And that's exactly what the Quakers promoted for a century before this, never changing their tune. They say it again and again: do what we tell you to do, or you will all die. This is what the Quakers said again and again and again and again. What, this man here is not a Quaker, and yet what he is saying is as Quaker as George Fox or anything else. And I guess that's my presentation, everyone. I think this one last point I would like to make is that, why did Quakers think they were better than others? Why did Quakers think they were better than Indigenous peoples? Why did Quakers give themselves over to pride? Why did Quakers turn their backs on Christ Jesus? Why did Quakers betray their own religion? And I think it goes back to the doctrine of discovery. And I'm not even talking about the papal bulls and all that bullshit. What I mean is the idea of the doctrine of discovery, that if you can convince yourself that other people are inferior to you, then it's no longer stealing, murdering, enslaving, raping. It's actually just the natural process of a superior race meeting an inferior race. This is the basis of the doctrine of discovery. It facilitates theft, and Quakers took part in that theft. And if a Quaker sat down and said, oh, maybe I'm a thief, maybe I've taken part in an imperial adventure, maybe I have betrayed Christ, maybe I betrayed everything. Well, that's too much for someone to take, right? It's much easier to say instead, these people are inferior. They're in trouble and dying and being killed, not because we're killing them, but because they're from inferior cultures. That's got to be it. And with that justification, it clears your conscience. And then, perversely, you turn around and you say, how do we save these people from us killing them? Well, we'll take their culture away as well. And that'll save them. Because, of course, if they're just like white people, we have no reason to kill them. They're just like us. I mean, that's as close as I can come to why Quakers participated in this. Anyways, I think that's all I have to say, friends, and I really appreciate you if you've stayed with me a bit longer.
So, David, maybe you're able to stop sharing your screen now.
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much, David. I know that David acknowledged this at the beginning of his talk, and I'm sure we are all feeling the impact of the truths that he shared with us tonight. And I want to acknowledge also that it's difficult to take in these truths. And so we're grateful for your listening. And one of the questions that appeared in the chat, and I'm not going to go through those questions or ask David to respond to them now because we do need to end this program. But one of the questions was, how can healing happen? And that is the question that is on our hearts as we take in these truths. And I think David's contribution in that path toward healing is to tell the truth. Because knowing the truth and coming eventually to a shared understanding between Native and non-Native people who live here in Turtle Island, coming to a common understanding of our history. Those are essential first steps in any path that can take us toward healing. So, David, I'm glad you have a warm cat there to help your heart at this moment. And I would suggest that all of us find some time now to hold ourselves and all of these difficult truths in our hearts and continue in our pursuit of processes that can take us toward healing as nations, as Indigenous peoples, and as friends. Let's have just a moment of silence together, and then Mackenzie is going to put in the chat a link to an evaluation form. And we really would appreciate if you would stay on and fill out this evaluation form before you leave today. It's a fairly simple form to fill out, but we would like your comments about this program. And it also gives you a chance, if you would like, to give us your contact information so that we can be in touch with you if you would like to engage in this work in any way, continuing going forward from today. So Mackenzie will put that link in the chat. You can fill out the form. And now, before we start doing that, let's have some peaceful silence together. Thank you, friends. I think we'll say good night. Thank you, David. Thank you, Mackenzie. And please do fill out the evaluation form. You can do that on your own right now if you would just access the link in the chat. Good night.